Well, hello. Thanks for continuing the lecture series here. We're going to look. We in the last video we looked at criticism, which is how a story is put or a book is put together. We're going to now look at interpretation, where we try to draw meaning by what a story means. And there are several times, just like with criticism, there are multiple types of interpretation. So we can read the Bible as a moral story, which means we're looking at the teachings and stories and trying to derive ethical principles and give us a guide to living a virtuous life. So we can look at moral lessons, we can look at values conveyed throughout the text, things like promoting justice, moral responsibility, etc. Some key elements to moral interpretation are the following. There are several key elements to consider. So the first thing is we want to look at the context. Where was it made? What was the historical background? Are there universal principles that apply across cultures and time periods, such as the Golden Rule or the Ten Commandments? The next thing is going to be, what's the redemptive historical view? Right? We talk about Jesus saving. So what is the story of how people are saved in all of these different stories in the Bible, and what does that tell us about how God acts? We can also read it for a Christological focus, always looking to the idea, since we're reading this from a Christian perspective, or at least in this class, how is this pointing us towards what we're going to how we understand Jesus and what that means for Jesus to live as a human being. And finally, we can try to apply it. How do these moral teachings from these stories apply to our own life and help us to be more virtuous? So, the benefits of moral interpretation are several. Number one, it can help us become more virtuous in understanding and applying moral teachings to make us live a more integral lives. It can also give us guidance. It can provide guidance to help us make decisions. We can look to these stories to help us guide our life. And finally, it helps to make community. If a bunch of people share the same sort of stories and the same moral interpretation, that help them make connections with each other. And so the moral interpretation can help us create community. So some limitations, though, of moral interpretation. Number one, it's not going to fully capture the context of the text, because our morals might be different than the morals of the people that wrote the text. And secondly, again, moral interpretations are going to vary across cultures and across time. And so we might not be able to come to an agreement, or it might not be as clear what the moral interpretation of the Bible is. So if we look at an example of a moral interpretation of the story of Genesis and the creation story, is number one, stewardship. Right, the second part of the story talks about taking care of the earth and subduing it, taking care of it. It also talks about the responsibility. We have a responsibility to protect and preserve the natural world, because human beings got to name all the animals and were put above them. And finally, that we should be caring for the earth. We should be nurturing and sustaining the environment, which was created for us by God out of love. Those are all moral interpretations of the Genesis creation stories. In addition to moral interpretations, we can also use an allegory to interpret the Bible. And by allegory, we mean examining the Bible looking for symbolic meanings that convey a deeper spiritual truth. So, for instance, we're going to be looking for deeper understandings of God's plan for humanity as it's revealed in the symbolism of the stories. So, one key element of this allegorical interpretation is we're going to be looking for symbols. Things that mean other things and have a deeper meaning. A lamb is not just a lamb. A snake is not just a snake. They mean something deeper. We're all going to also be looking for typology. What is there foreshadowing about Jesus' sacrifice in the stories of the Old Testament? We're also going to be looking for mysteries. Are they trying to convey something that's kind of just beyond our ability to understand? And so they're hinting at something about maybe the transcendent nature of God or the ultimate destiny of humanity. And finally, we can be applying this. We can take this allegorical approach and we can apply the Bible story to our own life and try to mimic what was happening there so that we can live closer to God. The benefits of this type of interpretation are we can have a deeper spiritual understanding. Looking at the allegorical significance of the Bible can make us more spiritual. It can also lead to personal transformation. It can guide us if we're applying these symbols and these teachings to our lives. They can help us become better people. And finally, these allegories can help us connect more deeply with God, because we're looking for those deeper meanings. It's not just a story about, Moses lighting a bush on fire or carving some rocks. There's a deeper meaning. It's not just a story about bread coming down from heaven. It's God caring for us, so we can make some deeper connections with God. The limitations of the allegorical interpretation, very simple. Number one, we're not looking at anything historical or looking at the original meaning. So we can be reading our own culture into the stories, and maybe in a way that was not intended by the authors. And secondly, there's going to be a broad number of interpretations of this text, and there's no one right way to read an allegory. So if we look at Genesis allegorically, we can see that the 6 days of creation might symbolize the steps we take towards spiritual enlightenment, moving from the most basic to the most complicated, the human being able to have a relationship with God. We can see light as a symbol of awakening or spiritual awareness or God's presence. We can see that in the creation of humans, that it might symbolize that we have some sort of divine spark, and each individual is an important part of that creation. So in the allegorical interpretation of the Bible, we're looking at symbolic meanings and looking at deeper truths. So going beyond this is a different one. So in addition to analogy, or in addition to allegory, we can look at analogies. And an analogy is looking for symbolic meanings inside of the text and making connections between Bible stories and our own lives using metaphor or allegory. So we do this by trying to explore deeper truths and going, again, like the previous one, going beyond the text and into a more symbolic significance. We seek to understand how stories and characters and events in the Bible can serve as mirrors and reflect our own experience and spiritual journeys. So the main way we do this is by using metaphor and allegory. So a metaphor is simply using one thing to represent something else, whereas an allegory is an entire story or narrative that symbolizes a deeper meaning. Right? So he is a bolt of lightning. That is one thing meaning something else in a metaphorical way. If I tell you a story about the little engine that could, that is an allegory, talking about one thing and using symbols to mean something else. Or another great allegory is the tale of the Wizard of Oz. It's not really about a girl who gets picked up by a tornado. It's really about the need for the United States to move from the gold-backed currency into bimetallism and all of the problems that farmers in Kansas are facing. So it's an allegory. The whole story is symbolic. And what this does is it helps us to find hidden wisdom inside of the text, so we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, and we can also look at parallels between our own lives and experiences and find inspiration and profound truths inside of these stories. So if we're looking at Genesis 1 and reading it as an analog, we can say that we can in day one it might be about recognizing the divine presence in our lives, creating harmony in relationships with others, that nature is creatively in our lives and at work. That day 4 is about taking responsibility for our role in caring for the world. Day 5 is embracing the diversity of life that comes in all of its forms. And day 6 might be about recognizing the value and dignity of all human life. And 7th is the importance of rest and reflection to lead the spiritual life and to just live as healthy human beings. So not the only way to read the creation story of Genesis 1, but one analogy you can make using the days as a guide for how to live your life. So in conclusion, we can see that the Bible is made of multiple perspectives. We can look at their perspectives in criticism, which is about how the book is put together and why it was written and who wrote it and why they wrote it and in the way they did. And then we can also look at interpretation. What can we learn and what meaning can we give to the stories inside of the Bible? And I hope in all this you see that the reason we're reading this book that's thousands of years old is because these messages have proven themselves to be timeless, just because they've lasted so long. So I hope these two lectures have been a bit of a help in helping you see some tools we're going to be using throughout the rest of the year to interpret Scripture in both the Old and the New Testaments.